Farah, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today. You and I have known each other for quite some time. Before we get started, maybe I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself, what you
Mhm.
do, what you're interested in the industry, and let's have some fun just chatting about the industry.
Okay. I love to chat. Thank you so much for inviting me, Wessam. We have known each other for a bit. I wouldn't say like super long, but going well so far. Hopefully, we'll stay friends here.
I haven't pissed you off
Um,
yet.
Not yet, not yet. You've been pretty good. So my name is Farah Amad. I'm the co-founder and CEO of PatientX, which is standardized patient experience measurement using scientifically validated survey instruments, solving for patient retention. I also wear another hat. I am the executive vice president of business development for the small to mid-size side of the biotech and pharma market at Eversana. And there I am leading a team that sells complete commercialization services and other outsourced commercialization services. But basically, in a nutshell, it's like a CRO for commercialization. So when companies get to later phase 2 or definitely in phase 3, they need to start thinking about how that asset's going to generate revenue for the company and how is it going to reach patients. And that is something that we do at Eversana. So those are my two hats. And you and I mostly know each other from PatientX. So just a little bit of my background. I know I look like a spring chicken, but I've been in the industry for 25 years. I actually started as a chemist in the preclinical world. So I was in bioanalysis and I was an analytical chemist. I had a little team of analysts and analyzing concentration time graphs and test article, and started to think about where is all this data going? What does this all mean? What am I doing here? What's the bigger picture? And started to move up to be able to see the bigger and bigger picture. Went into business development, eventually went into clinical. So I've spent about 17 years in the CRO world. Most of that has been in clinical. Most of that has been in phase 1 and bioanalysis, so early development. I also spent a little bit of time in clinical study budgeting technology, so SaaS. I was a chief commercial officer at Strategicon Pharma. And then following that, I joined Press Ganey as the president of life sciences. And that's what brought me to the patient experience side of the world. And that's where I met you, Wissam. It's all been uphill from that point on.
That's a lot. You've learned a lot. You've worn a lot of hats in this industry, and I am delighted to have you here. Let's talk a little bit more about what are you seeing? You started Patient X for a reason. You were at Press Ganey for a reason that is really more or less tied to Patient X, right?
Yeah.
What's your passion behind it? What are you seeing in the industry that's not working that made you do this? Or maybe you're seeing some things are working better than others. I'd love your experience and your thoughts.
Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, at the heart of hearts, I'm a service person. I love being on the service side. I like to serve clients. Really began, that's how I cut my teeth in the industry. That's how I gained recognition and started to move up, is that my clients liked working with me. And that was because even when I was in operations and delivering bioanalytical projects, I was really focused on communication and ensuring that things were on time and that we had good, credible services and that we provided good expertise and that we had that kind of human touch. And I think wearing my business hat, it always bothered me that when you get into clinical, you're actually talking about human beings. So I think it's, the clinical research industry or the pharma industry is one of the only industries that the major component of the supply chain is human. And yet we don't always view it that way. So the stories that you hear and the way, especially earlier in the industry, the earlier days that I spent in my career, we didn't really talk about patients and participants with the respect that they actually deserve as being not only like a critical component of the supply chain, but they're really partners in us delivering new medications to the market. And the idea of the co-creation and elevating the patient voice really resonated with me. And then when I saw that this is a very simple and elegant approach. We're trying to solve these problems like 30% dropout rates, 85% trials starting late, retention or dropout costing the industry $12 billion annually. These are huge problems. But at the end of the day, it's human beings behind all of this. And it's human beings that decide whether they enroll in the trial, whether they feel comfortable in the trial, whether they continue in the trial every day. But yet we don't necessarily do the things that help humans feel comfortable in that experience. So that's really what got me interested in the idea of standardized measurement. And a little personal side note, I come from a very science-heavy family, right? I'm biochemist and business. My dad was a chemist and a businessman, right? So we have that kind of like basic foundation. Both my brothers are engineers in aerospace. And then my sister, we always would make fun of her because she was the soft scientist. She was an anthropologist, brilliant anthropologist from Stanford. But we were always like, what is this? This is like soft science. And then here I am actually running this company that has everything to do with behavioral science and survey science and how human beings make decisions. And it's actually a science. It actually is predictable. You can take what we might consider as subjective feedback and convert that into a reliable data set so that it does generate an ROI from a business standpoint. As a scientist, it interests me. And as a business person, it interests me. But as somebody who's committed to serving clients, and in many cases, patients are the main stakeholders, we need to serve them better. So that's what got me interested in this whole area.
As we talk about patient engagement, retention, compliance, to your point, they're huge problems. Compliance by far has got to be one of the toughest things to crack in the industry. Retention as well. But I always ask, listen, for Delve, this is really the basis of the company. But sometimes I wonder, do we care? Does pharma even care?
Yeah.
And the reason that makes me wonder is we're doing the same thing that we've been doing 20 years ago. If you try to get them to change to do something just slightly a little bit different, it's hard, right? Is it working? Is it not working? And nobody is willing to say, hey, let's give it a try. Let's try it long enough until we get it to work.
Yeah.
But I'm interested your thoughts, like how are you feeling as you push in PatientX? How did you feel at Press Ganey as you tried to push this idea through? Who cares about this at the end of the day?
Yes, that's a great point. And in fact, I was talking to my sales leader just earlier this morning, and as we're in Ramadan, right? So we're a bit more grumpy. I don't know about you, but I'm a bit more grumpy than I normally am. I'm a little bit less optimistic, right? Because you wake up in the morning and you just want coffee and you can't have it, right? For 12 hours. I'm going to answer today in that spirit, but this is what I was talking to my colleague about earlier today, is that sometimes it feels very overwhelming, right? And the idea is, how do you turn an elephant, right? And the answer is one step at a time. That's the only way to do it. So I think we need to, I know we're very like type A personalities often in this industry, right? We're drivers and we want to see change. I think we need to really celebrate the orientation, the small orientation towards this better future. So for example, when I was at Press Ganey and I started talking about this, it was like light bulbs were going off for a lot of people. They thought it was like a crazy concept, right? If we think about trial awareness and all the technology that we put in, all the dollars we put into recruitment technology, like even way before upstream. And then like I had a lot of leaders from these technology companies telling me like, we do such a good job. And then they direct these patients to the sites and then the site doesn't call them back. What happens there? So you put this energy in and there's this gap between these like point solutions, or these, what the patient would see is that I'm interacting here online, then all of a sudden it goes dark and I'm waiting for someone to call me. What's the continuous? What kind of glues all these gaps together? What's the patient? The patient is that voice that has a continuous connection to all of those points in time. So it just makes sense that's the resource that we should be thinking about. So going back to these, like moving the elephant, at the beginning, people really were very receptive, but when it came to actually doing anything, everyone's, is she okay with this? Is he okay with this? Like, how are you going to do this? And it's very hard to get those first movers that are willing to take the step. And then how do we take the step? We take the step very carefully. And so now that I'm leading PatientX and I look back at the prior 3 years of when I was starting to work on this, I have seen a lot of progress, right? It is more common. People don't think it's such a crazy idea to, hey, let's ask the patient how they feel. And let's consider the patient voice as a resource and as a data set. So I think that there is progress. It is slow. All we can do is keep trying. There's only one direction we can move in, right? And that's forward. So I would love to see more collaboration between the different segments in the industry. I think that's where we kind of lack. We have sites are really tight. They tend to do things together. The tech companies, they tend to like really listen, create really wonderful solutions. And then we get like the pharma people that want to look at what are the other pharma companies doing. I think where we are missing is that intersection between those different components, right? That's where we have to improve collaboration and improve like that. If we're talking about data insights, everyone should benefit from the one data point that the patient provides, right? That is how we motivate all of these components that are of equal importance to move forward. I'm a sports person. I like to play a lot of sports. And I used to ask my teams, let's say soccer, who's the most important player on the pitch? And people say, oh, it's the striker, it's the keeper, it's the whatever, the midfield. Actually, no, that there is no most important player, right? Everybody has a role to play. And we have to all be moving in the same direction. So that's what I believe is the solution, and how we respond to your question is that it is a bit discouraging that it moves so slowly, but if we collaborate more and we hold each other accountable and we recognize that all of these stakeholders need a piece, right, of value, and not the least of which is the patient. The patient needs the value as well. And that's just how human beings are. And we can move forward more progressively.
How do you see it different in the commercial world?
Yeah, the commercial world is very interesting. I think there's a lot of the same kind of challenges, right? There is a little bit less collaboration just because the model of commercialization tended to be more siloed. And I think it's going in a more integrated way, the way clinical is, but they're a little bit further behind. So I think it's still very siloed, and the power of the pieces all connecting is really amazing. So I would say that one thing that's interesting in commercial that is different than in pharma is that you see there really is the ability for the smaller companies to now take big swings. And that's what makes it very exciting, is it really could change the dynamic. And we see 70% of pipelines are now small and mid-sized biotech and pharma. And so that is going to change the game quite significantly as we now start to see those small and mid-sized biotech and pharma reaching the market and being successful alone in many cases with outsourced partner versus a large pharma partner. And so I think that it still has that same resonance that we are all here to serve the patient. And the more we can collaborate between different solutions to avoid those kind of gaps, the more we move forward collectively, as opposed to, even if it's one step, we take one step forward together, as opposed to one group taking 1,000 steps forward and leaving everyone else behind, which doesn't really serve the industry and patients as a whole.
So you brought in something that I thought was interesting. So you talked about some sort of middle layer to make it all happen, to stitch it all together.
Yeah.
And it made me think, if you were inside pharma, you're designing your own clinical trial, what would you do to stitch these pieces together to bring in that middle layer to whether it's to look at innovation, to look at the patient, knowing what we know today, where nobody wants to hear of more adverse events. Everybody
Right.
really cares at the end of the day about the data that you get in, so that way you can deliver a better clinical trial, get your drug approved. What would you do? How would you design it?
Yeah, I think so. Something that's happening now that is I don't know that it's routine, but certainly like when I was in phase one, the investigators that we worked with at the University of Miami, for example, there was one gentleman there, one of the investigators that would often be consulted for his advice, right? And that was because of the type of trials he was doing or the type of patient population that he was representing, very ill people and difficult for them to take on too much burden in the trial. So I think that's just like the tip, right? And that's the model. So now we do see many companies that do consult with, let's say, patients, like patient advocates, right, beforehand. But I think it could almost take a step further where you could almost create like a mock ecosystem of the trial, right? And take a few of the partners, vendors together and say, how do we make this the most efficient trial possible? Things like if the patient is at the visit, how do we not make them wait for 4 hours and waste time that they could be with their family or at work? How do we help them feel that they have all the information they need at their fingertips to be compliant? How do we create a environment that they trust and all the interfaces of who they see as the face of the trial kind of work together to enable them to feel that these guys really have my best interests at heart. I understand what's happening to me. I'm going to sign up for this trial. And in fact, I'm going to go tell my friends about it. So I think that ultimately preparation and thinking above one's own direct benefit. So collaborating in a way that values the input from all the stakeholders is really how we design more intelligent trials.
How do you view innovation in this world?
You're asking me a lot of tough questions today, Wessam.
I'm really not. We're just having fun. I'm just trying to poke at you a little bit more. Like
Okay,
honestly,
okay.
like they're all everybody has their own perspective, right? And
Yeah,
hearing from all these different people, and even on the prior podcasts, is
yeah,
interesting. Like even when we talk about innovation, is it AI? Is it a new tool? Is it a new human
yeah.
being? Like innovation, for example, has so many different arms. How do we think of innovation? How do we bring innovation into this industry? And what probably 90% of innovation fails in this industry, believe it or
Mhm.
not. So yeah, I don't know. Patient X, it sounds like a new innovative solution to gain better retention. So innovation has become kind of part of why you started Patient X.
Yes.
As you sit there and think of the industry, you think of patients, what does innovation look like to you? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's tough because I think we're all constrained by the lens of business, right? And viability. What is it? Is it I'm like drawing a blank here, but there are certain companies, I think it's 3M, that is notorious for fostering innovation, right? So when I was doing my MBA, we would learn about these like incubators that 3M would do. And I can't recall the specifics, but they would have some kind of like benefits for their employees to come up with like crazy ideas. And they would allow for the time and the space for people to explore things that maybe doesn't have an immediate commercial application. But here's an interesting component and go figure it out. So I think that part of the way we constrain innovation today is with a lot of business machinery around it, right? Like it's got to make sense. You got to hit the right market. You got to generate investor growth, right? All of this to a certain extent, I feel like at some point stifles it, right? You got to make sure you're not upsetting this person who's sitting on that empire, right? I do feel that innovation should be more free to explore and exist and generate traction before necessarily like generating traction with regards to what it's trying to achieve before it actually makes a whole lot of business sense. And I know that sounds ridiculous, right? But I do think that there is more space that we could allot for innovation without those constraints that we tend to see in the market, so that it forces it to be more viable than it's maybe ready to be. And if you like, we've had some tough times, right, in the industry with funding, and we had COVID, right? We had some challenges that we had to go through. And as a result, there were probably some really good ideas that got lost. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that we need to allow ourselves some more space to be clever and to try to solve these big problems, because they're not small issues, right? The big problems tend to be complicated, and they've been problems forever because they are complicated and they are deep-seated, and they involve a lot of different stakeholders, and they involve a lot of different players. So that's one way I think that we can improve, is just to not be as constrained. And I don't know if maybe schools have a role, if big companies have a role there, but I think the more we can allow ourselves to tinker, the more we can end up with ideas that stick and actually make a meaningful contribution towards a goal. There are so many of those challenges, right? When we think about clinicaltrial.gov, very hard for people to understand, very hard to navigate, right? But there's a lot of companies that have thrived on that fact, right? They've created technologies that read it, pull it apart, and create interfaces that are more patient-friendly. Sometimes it's difficult to think about how do we monetize some of those solutions, right? And my brain from the business side always goes there. Okay, but this is really interesting, but how do you monetize it? Sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice by being so capitalist. If we could just move it forward, eventually I think we can make enough headway that it makes sense. So that's my business spiel on innovation.
I think you're right. I'm a computer science major. I come from the data world, so I'm a geek at heart. And the monetization to me was the last thing I thought of. For me, I'd sit down, code something. Oh, this is cool. I think everybody would love it.
Yes,
But to your point, over time, you learn the tough truth, which is if you have something that nobody wants to buy, you've got nothing.
that's right.
So even if we try to innovate, in my mind, it might be innovative, but if nobody really cares to buy it, it
Yeah,
might be just innovative to me, and that's about it at the end of the day.
yeah, true.
But yeah, innovation is hard. We look at the last 10 years in this industry, and we look and see where did innovation go? What has been the most innovative thing that we've done in this industry? I don't know that I can think of one, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
EDC was innovative 20 some years ago, but that was about it. We have mobile apps for patients, for eCOA, wearables, etc. But even you look at the digital biomarker trend, and that has died down quite a bit. And it's innovation, I think, is hard. It's a difficult thing to grasp and
yeah,
get our arms around.
yeah.
I have even a tougher question for you. So and this is one that actually me and on another podcast, me and the person I was podcasting with, we were going at it, and he asked me that question, and to be honest with you, you can probably answer it different ways, but who owns the patient? Who owns the data? Is it the patient, the sponsor, or the site?
It's a very good question. I'm going to say the site. I'm going to say the site. Yeah. And the reason why is, in actual fact, I think you're asking me the question in a binary manner. And I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, right? Everyone needs a piece for it to be interesting. And it's not the same piece, different pieces. So what is the data the patient wants?
But is it that the sponsor's paying for it? So isn't it the sponsor data? Patient comes in, you consent him, site gets paid, investigator gets paid. So shouldn't it be the sponsor data?
The sponsor should get a layer of that data, but only the data that makes sense to them. They could get all the data, but they're not looking at the data necessarily in the same way that the site's looking at the data. So the way I view it is, let's call this a diamond, right? This kind of subjective view of what comes out of all of this research, right? There's a diamond that comes out of it. The diamond has many facets. The patient deserves one view of that diamond, right? The sponsor deserves another view of that diamond. And the site deserves another one. And maybe you and I, as tech service providers, have another view of that diamond, right? Everyone gets what they need from the same set of data, just looking at it in a different way. And I think that's the best way to think of collaboration. So if you think about a patient's interests in the trial, what are they interested in? If you actually ask a patient, why do you participate in a trial? There's a self-serving component, right? Where maybe it's compensation, maybe it's they get access to the best healthcare, maybe they are really in need of that medication, right, for their condition. So there's that kind of self-serving side of it. But then there's another side that we often forget, is that there is a kind of paid forward advancing science. I'm doing this, I'm taking on this trial so that maybe somebody else doesn't have to go through what I just went through, right? And that is actually the grand majority of participation in trials, is for that other reason, is for advancing science, is for paying it forward to patients. And the least we could do is thank them for that contribution. They're giving their time, they're giving their bodies, right? We could just thank them. And what do they want to know? So if they're participating to advance science, they want to know, hey, guys, what happened with all this research? Did you advance science? Did you move forward? What did you learn? That secret belongs to them as well, right? It's not just us. It's not just the pharma company. They have put their body into this trial. And for us to not share that back with them, that feels unfair.
You bring
Now,
up
if you think
a
about the site's perspective, right? The site is mobilizing their team. They're creating that face of the trial. They're portraying the image of the industry that we want patients to get, right? And that takes a certain degree of expertise and human connection. And that they want to know, how do they leverage what the data is back to improve their operation and continue to refine their craft, right? Same thing for the sponsor. The sponsor wants to know, hey, I've designed this study. How did this kind of work? What worked, what didn't work? Using Delve Health, understanding compliance. What is working, what's not working? Let me go design a better study. Let me go design a better ICF, right? And we would argue similar on let's say, the Delve Health side. What do you want to know? You want to know how the interaction with your technology went, right? What you can do to improve, how you can differentiate, how you can provide a more competitive product. So that's how I view it, is that I think we need to really think about how we win together, including the patient, and not alone.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. When we started Delve, our first focus was oncology, just because of my mom, etc.
Yeah.
So we're we did quite a bit in oncology. And as part of one of the engagements, we actually went out, we talked to patients, and we're trying to figure out what is their advantage? Why do they want to be a part of clinical trials? And one of the questions was, is it to make money? Do you care to make money? Do you even care about your data? And some were like, it'd be good to make money, but at the end of the day, I want to feel better. And then we
Yeah.
had, to your point, we had a good portion, like probably 25% of the people that were like, I'm only doing it to pay it forward because I know I'm not going to be here for long. So how can I make it better for others that might have the same disease or help
Right.
them survive? And it was very touchy in so many different ways. And to your point, we owe them something.
Mhm.
Whether it's the data, whether it's a simple thank you, whether it's, hey, we're there for you. I honestly don't know what the right mix is,
Yeah.
but I think we owe the patients something. And that's
Yeah.
why patient care for us has been deep and core to everything that we do at the site, at the sponsor, the whole continuum from a patient journey
Yeah.
perspective.
Absolutely.
Um, at the end of every,
An easy one now, an easy question.
so this one is actually going to be fun, right? So
Okay.
this one is, so at the end, I always ask people a question, not knowing who the next person will be on the podcast.
Okay.
What would you ask that person? So for you, I have a question that the prior person asked,
Okay.
and that is, what is the one thing you learned in the industry that you would have never thought of?
That is a great question. I would say that the one thing I learned in the industry, and I'm going to juxtapose that with before I was in the industry. Okay. So when you're trying to get into the industry, when you're like fresh out of school and you're looking for a job, you tend to have this impression that only the most brilliant people that have dedicated so much of their lives to this space can be successful. I think what I've learned in the industry has been really what generates success is the passion that people have for change. The number of people that I've met in the industry that have no background in life sciences, they, like you mentioned, what did you just say before? You started in oncology because of your mom. That to me is really what it's all about. One of the other entrepreneurs that I met, I think it was her sister that was sick, and they tried desperately to find a clinical trial. She couldn't find it. It was very hard to find the clinical trial. And so she became an entrepreneur to build an easier way for patients to find clinical trials. She wasn't from the industry. And she took a very different view of the problem, the challenge, and created a very different solution. And I think that's really what I've learned is that you need a lot of different types of people to bring about innovation and bring about change. And the people that tend to really stick it out, they come from somewhere that starts with passion. And it doesn't matter what school you went to, it doesn't matter, what program you were in, right? What position you have. People that make a difference, they do so because they have a really strong why. And I see your little remember why you started. And if you're going to ask me for the question that I'm going to ask to the next person, I knew you were going there. It's going to be around that. So are you going to ask me?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it. Shoot it. Let's do it.
Okay. On my LinkedIn profile, I have a quote from the White Stripes. Remember the group, the White Stripes? And one of the songs that they sing, it talks about when you're in a little room and you have you're working on something big. You're working on a big idea. And eventually, if things go well, you're going to end up being in a big room, right? And how do you stay in that big room? You have to remember how you got into the little room initially.
Is this a puzzle or a question?
It's a question. So my question for your next guest, Wessam, is, how ideally ask this to somebody that has progressed so far in their career, right? How do they go back to why they started? And what does that do for them on a daily basis to make the right decisions to continue to push forward?
I love it.
Yeah.
Farah, I know you're fasting. I don't want to piss you off anymore. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate this. This was fun.
It was fun.
It was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wessam.